Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today, I want to take a different look, a different perspective on the Gettysburg battle. I want to look at it through the eyes of those who were there after the battle ended, the nurses who were there for months after the battle was over. One of them is pictured here. Her name is Hattie Dada, and she arrives in Gettysburg on July 8th, just a few days after the battle. Imagine her as she's coming through town in a supply laden ambulance wagon through the streets and into the Pennsylvania countryside. Again, this is on July 8th. Just a few days later, where she was riding was a hot mess. A brutal fighting had engulfed the fields, orchards, and woods. Now she was on her way to a hospital assignment. She later wrote, quote, "The road was filled with army wagons, ambulances, and wounded soldiers on their way to the railroad. All the way, the houses, trees, and thrown down fences showed where shot and shell had sped on their mission of death and destruction." As she added, nearly every house had the red hospital flag, and here and there were stacks of guns which had been gathered from the battlefield. Off at the left of the road, in the edge of the woods, could be seen the newly made graves of those who had fallen. That ambulance ride ended not too long afterwards at the George Bushman farm. The main house, the barn, and surrounding fields had been converted into a temporary tent hospital for the 12th Corps. Over the next 3 months, she and other nurses and medical personnel cared for hundreds of wounded and sick men on both sides up till July 21st. And then they relocated the hospital. Harriet went with them to town, a hospital closer to town. Years later, in 1884, she shared her reminiscences in the National Tribune. I highly recommend it. You can find it on newspapers.com. It's a collection of wonderful stories by the veterans and other participants in the war. Hattie writes often, and she's prolific and writes with great detail about her experiences. Way too much to go into in one episode, but I'm going to give you three passages to give you a flavor of what she had to say. First passage is about her encounter with a Confederate soldier. Then we've got some Union soldiers, and then I'm going to talk about and share with you a visit that she made to the battlefield before she left Gettysburg. So let's start with the Confederate soldier, and give you a little refresher too. When I first reached the 12th Army Corps Hospital, there were about 800 there, but in 10 days' time, the number was reduced to 300, some having died and others having left. Of those remaining, quite a number were Confederates, and the orders were to take as good care of them as our own wounded. Quote, "What, will you take care of me too, lady?" was the inquiry of a wounded Confederate. "Yes," said I, "we treat you just as we want our boys treated when they are taken prisoners." That was her reply. In one of the tents was John S. Lynch of the 3rd Alabama, in whom I became much interested. He was an earnest, simple Christian, and his faith in God was so childlike. Then, too, he used to speak so tenderly of his mother. One day he said, "If my mother only knew how kind you are to me. It will kill my mother for me to die without her knowing of my fate. I believe the Almighty will restore me." But he was so severely wounded in his right thigh, it kept growing worse. The last rational words I heard him speak were, "Mother, you and I will meet in heaven." In his portmanteau was found a piece of paper on which were these lines: "Work nor play on the Sabbath day, neither idle away God's holy day, but think and sing of the glorious King. Consider his goodness to everything. Climb above to the land of love, and seek the rest prepared for the blessed, where sleep the lambs on his breast. Walking in the somber light, we know not we can live aright. He calls us to land that's bright. His will be done. We know it's right." Hattie continues. I sent a letter by a flag of truce, giving her, the mother, the particulars of his death. And after the war, I learned that she received it. So that's Hattie's recollection of her encounter with Confederate soldier in the 3rd Alabama. Now let's get to some Union soldiers. I've got two. Quote, a few days before we left the old camp, it's around July 21st, a young Massachusetts boy had his leg amputated below the knee. He was under my special care and with others was brought on a stretcher to this hospital, and I had him placed in Dr. May's ward, knowing he would receive the best of care. In a few days, he became conscious that his recovery was doubtful and wrote a farewell letter to his sister. The date was on the 24th, and on the 31st, he, Corporal Theodore Butters of the 2nd Massachusetts, died. He was as brave and noble a youth as ever faced death on the battlefield. The Sunday following, his only sister, to whom he had written this letter, arrived, but too late to see her brother. Her heart was nearly broken on learning that he was dead and buried. In my own ward, there were 4 double tents, and I've kept a record of the names of all the inmates, how they were wounded, and the result in each case, so far as I could learn. August 3rd, we sat down to a table to eat for the first time in 2 weeks. It's almost a month of working. She has another story to share in the next paragraph. S.W. Woodman of the 2nd Massachusetts from South Danvers was in my ward, badly wounded in his left arm. 3 times the surgeons thought of amputating it, but concluded he was too weak to endure it. We washed the wound with a strong acid and gave him the best of care and diet. After a while, he commenced to improve, and we saw he was well enough to go on to Philadelphia to the hospital there. In January 1866, I wrote to his mother to learn how he was and received a reply written by himself that he was at home and apparently well. So that ends on a high note. Now I want to take you to October, late October, just a few weeks before Abraham Lincoln visits. At this point, the final touches, the finishing touches are being made for the National Cemetery. But Hattie Dada is not going to be around. She has a new assignment. She's heading to Tennessee. So on October 23rd, she's getting ready to leave. The day before she leaves, with another nurse, Sally Dysart, she visits the battlefield for the first time since she'd been there in June. So almost 3 months, more than 3 months of nonstop work until she finally gets a chance to tour the battlefield. And here's what she writes about it. The General Hospital was located on that part of the field where the Confederate General Ewell's forces were stationed. All the way from that part to Culp's Hill, nothing could then be seen except the ground, here and there, plowed up by the shells. Scattered about were stray knapsacks, bayonet sheaths, and a few unmarked graves, till we came near the breastworks which had been thrown up by the 12th Army Corps, General Slocum's. From behind these fortifications must have issued a terrible storm of bullets. Judging from the number of trees that had been struck and killed, and the trenches in which the Confederates dead. There, too, many of our boys received their wounds, as they told me, and many fell, as the graves indicated, from New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Michigan. Under a tree in a field was an only grave, that of Winfield Scott, a dear boy from St. Lawrence County, New York. It was said that he was the only one killed in his regiment in that engagement. The winter before, he was in our hospital at Harper's Ferry and was loved by all. The day before we left Aquia Creek, he came over to the hospital to see us. The breastworks on Culp's Hill showed the location of the 1st Army Corps on the right wing of our army, at the left of the 12th Army Corps during the last day's fighting. On the ridge to the left, we passed the place where the 11th Army Corps was stationed in the center. Proceeding through the cemetery, which was near down where the Taneytown Road, we came to the place where General Meade has his headquarters and where the shells came so fast. The effects were still very apparent. As we passed up the rise of ground, we came to where the Second Army Corps had fought so desperately. On seeing the exposed position, we did not wonder that the list of killed and wounded exceeded that of any other corps. From there, we passed to where the Third and Fifth Army Corps held the field when the battle raged so terribly the last day, and where first were caught the words which were carried from corps to corps. "They are retreating," one dying man near Culp's Hill heard the shouting, and asked what it meant. On being told, he said, "I am satisfied to die." On Little Round Top, where the Third Army Corps was, nature had built a strong defense for our men from the enemy's balls by piling rocks upon rocks, in the fissures of which could still be seen the remains of some of the Confederates, bleached by the weather. Coming back to town from Little Round Top, we saw traces of fighting all the way. We passed the peach orchard where so many of the New Hampshire boys fell in battle. Near the town, we left the Emmitsburg Road and crossed over to the Chambersburg Road, where, in a field alone, was a little grave on the headboard of which was simply inscribed, "Drummer Boy." No one knew his name, and perhaps his loving mother never learned of his death. Passing along, we came to the house of John Burns, that old man of 70 years who, on the first day of battle, took his gun, joined the 7th Wisconsin, and fought with them till he was wounded 3 times, the last wound disabling him. He was left on the field, but the next day managed to get back to his house. Some sympathizing neighbors informed the Confederates what he had done. Soon after, he was visited by some of their officers, and upon their leaving, a ball came whizzing through the window, entering the window just over his head. They evidently intended to kill him. In the First Army Corps was the 147th New York, which lost so heavily the first day in killed and wounded. Among those killed was the gallant Lieutenant Mace of Oswego County, New York. In childhood, we were at school together, and there, after 20 years, I stood where he had given his life for his country. At one time, there were 2,000 of the wounded in the general hospital. When we left, nearly all were gone. Many had died, and in the burying ground nearby were 300 graves. Hattie ends with a quote, "And yet, why weep for those that sleep in a loyal soldier's grave? 'Tis enough to know their blood did flow for the cause of the good and the brave." So there you have it, some passages from the reminiscences of Nurse Hattie Dada at Gettysburg. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode.